Everybody, welcome to my very first video. I'm going to be reviewing every album from January that I have listened to. So this has been 9 albums. There hasn't necessarily been as many this month as there will be for future months like February, March, and etc. Mainly because January is not necessarily the best point for bands to release material, or any artist to release material for that matter, because it's just after Christmas and it's just the start of the year. I mean, some bands might want to start the year off like that way, and that's fair, but honestly, it's just not a lot of artists or record labels like decisions they want to go out for. They want to at least give it a month or two before releasing stuff, so that makes sense why it's not necessarily around this point. But these are the albums that did come out in January, and some are pretty good, some are not so good, and I have pretty much listed them in categories. I have the worst albums of the month, I have alright albums, but for this case, since January, I haven't really had any, so there's not really an album I thought was in the middle. It's just pretty much been albums I liked and albums I disliked. And that being said, let's go straight into the first album on the worst. I'll start with the worst and build up to the best. So the first thing I want to talk about is the new MANESKIN album, Rush. This album just feels bloated with tracks. Some songs literally warp and feel very similar in sound, and some songs just absolutely are just a pain in the ass to sit through and listen to. Many Cool Kids and blah 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 are the songs I personally thought were some of the worst things I've heard from MANESKIN, and I probably would consider them high potential, some of the worst stuff that could come out this year. Like, generally, if I had to think of top 10 worst songs of the year, these are good contenders for them so far. Cool Kids, I just generally dislike the overall theming of this one, the sounds, the vocals, just the lyrics. This one is just trying to pander to, oh yeah, the Cool Kids, look how cool we. It's just not a very strong song whatsoever, and blah 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 literally has the writing style sound like Wet Leg, with its blah 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 sort of just repetitiveness to try and stay in your head, and it does do that, I guess, but not in the way that it works for Wet Leg. It kind of works for Wet Leg, and more so it has a sort of fresh take on it, whereas this just feels, this is just bad for the sake of being bad. I don't like Wet Leg, but I think the way that they have written some of their more annoying songs, it feels like there's more identity found in it. It just kind of has a bit more, I guess, nuance to it, and this one just does not. These two songs are pretty bad. One song on this album did have Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, and I thought that was probably the most wasted potential on this album. The track Gossip, it wasn't a very good performance. It wasn't anything crazy from Tom Morello. There was nothing that really stood out from this. This is kind of just, basic guitar work. It just felt like there wasn't really much room for Tom to work with on this track, so it's nothing to really get excited about, in my opinion. I'd definitely say the Italian-focused songs felt stronger in sound and direction as a whole, like Left Fine and Mark Chapman. I personally just think these ones have a lot more kind of an identity that feels more or less something like MANESKIN would do, and it definitely feels like some of the stronger stuff on this record, which they're not great, they're not crazy good, but they're definitely some of the better tracks, ones that I did go back to a few times because they had some good instrumentation. I think the overall performance is good. Unfortunately, didn't help when there's 11 songs before it that were at best okay. It just felt there was a lot of songs that could have been cool filler, and you could have cut the fat and got to the kind of main sound that MANESKIN wanted to have throughout this record. And I would have liked more songs sort of this direction, because I think the instrumentals are a bit better. I think the overall just drive it has, it definitely works well in their sound, and it's definitely something I would have liked them to explore more. But unfortunately, shortly after that, you go into tracks like Mamma Mia and Supermodel, which I would consider two very weak singles for this album. Probably some of the worst stuff to hype up the album with. I haven't really necessarily seen the release of this album. I wasn't really following MANESKIN, so I just kind of heard it when it came out. But Yeah, then definitely it's definitely a weak ending, especially with the loneliness, the final track. It just isn't a very good, strong, concrete concept of an album. I did not like this one. I gave it a 1.5 out of 5 rating. I I would consider this probably one of the worst albums, for sure on this list. It is the lowest rated, and I can definitely see this being possibly bottom 5 for the whole year, unless it's just a lot of weak material coming out. This is definitely not a good album, in my opinion. We've got a new one by We Are Scientists, the new album Lobes. I do like the dance rock synth pop direction they take, but I don't think it necessarily works with uh, as many of the tracks as it would like to. I consider the first couple of tracks and the last couple of tracks to pretty much be the best stuff. So you have this bit in the middle, just a collection of songs that I don't think it necessarily has the strengths that songs like Operator Error or Parachutes has, where I think it can tell it builds up the story that the lead singer is trying to tell. It definitely has a personal sound to it, and the electronic sounds, the synth pop, the dance rock sound, it definitely blends in with some of the earlier elements, just kind of feeling like a homage to the older sound while going in quite a different direction. But I just think the middle of the album isn't very interesting. I just feel it has a less unique drive. It doesn't really have much punch or just anything that necessarily stands out. And I even think the writing kind of dips a little bit around this point. But it's not too bad. I just think this album was just not as good as it could have been. I think this album is sort of a 2. We have a new one by the Swedish rock band Suasion. This is a very small band, so you might have not heard of this, but I have followed Suasion since their debut album Stardust, and I actually thought it wasn't such a bad record. It wasn't anything chaotically good, but I definitely thought it was an interesting sound, and definitely thought it had an interesting sound. And The Infinite goes for a different direction, but it honestly felt like a mixed bag of ideas that just, well, some of it definitely feels like a step up from Stardust. A lot of it just doesn't necessarily work as well, sonically, for the most part. The mixing feels quite inconsistent when it comes to the guitars, such as fading into the synths. This was quite a common thing in the track Celestial, and it just kept popping out abruptly in tracks afterwards. So I don't know, it just kind of felt there wasn't necessarily a consistency, because sometimes the vocals would sort of blend in when the guitars were either too loud, and sometimes the guitars were too quiet and you couldn't really hear the instrumentals properly. I just thought the mixing wasn't necessarily as good on this one, nowhere near as good as Stardust for sure. The album feels more repetitive in sound too. You can definitely tell there's some inspiration with bands like Electric Callboy, and it's definitely driven this for a more heavy take, but Suasion just feels less unique. They have a weaker mix, and the songwriting just doesn't feel necessarily as good. And there's also a few points later in the album where there's just a lot going on with the electronics, and it just kind of overwhelms some of the sound this album has. So it kind of feels like a little bit of a letdown. Yeah, I'll give this one a 2. We have a new one by the band White Reaper, and this probably is the best album on the worst category, Asking for a Ride. It definitely has some interesting ideas, and it has got quite a bit of spark with the punk indie blend they have, and it works on tracks like Fog Machine and Bozo, but some of the times it just kind of feels a bit like a slump, and it kind of loses identity later on with the album, because it's sort of trying to figure out how to do a different take on it, and you end up getting some songs like Heaven or Not, which feel like filler tracks, and we some albums do get filler tracks, that's something that happens, but the fact this album is really short, it's less than 30 minutes, and Heaven or Not just feels like a filler track, isn't a good start in my opinion to this year, and it's kind of disappointing, to be honest. Sonically, it just struggles to balance itself as well. It has these ideas of punk, indie, and hard rock, but it kind of blends together in a way that it just makes each song stand out for the worst, and just some songs just you wouldn't really remember. It definitely makes some of them more forgettable. It has some good potential, but I just don't think it delivered too well. I was close to giving it a 2.5, but I think 2 is probably the best for this. Starting off the best albums of the month, we have Beyond the Black self-titled album, which, unlike previous records, it just cuts the fat entirely, making it their shortest album. But I personally like the fact it does this. It definitely gives all these tracks more room to breathe. It doesn't necessarily feel as much songs with strained ideas, and they're going for some overall some pretty good sounds in my opinion. A lot of the songs have a very unique sort of drive to them. A lot of songs have its own theme and gives it a whole unique palette, like Dancing in the Dark, which adds some folk metal influence throughout, which is pretty interesting. And I like how a lot of these songs just have an overall different sound and some pretty punchy choruses as well. And it definitely shows that the lead singer was in a pop band before, because some of these choruses would fit right at home with the band that she was in beforehand. But yep, I definitely thought this was a good album. It wasn't anything crazy good, but I did enjoy this record quite a bit. I give it a 3 out of 5. We have a new one by the Polish progressive rock band Riverside. I have never heard of this band until I saw ID.Entity pretty much released, and I decided to give it a listen, and it kicks off to a really good start. Honestly, Friend or Foe is so much better than it needed to be. It's such a powerful opener, fantastic riffs, the synths on this just give it such a brilliant sound. I honestly really enjoyed this one, and they do keep this consistency up with some really iconic guitar work, some really good use of electronics. It definitely has a really good aesthetic when it comes to that. The vocalist Mariusz Duda, I hope I pronounced that right, excels with just honestly incredible vocal performances, which holds up just as well as the previous stuff. I haven't necessarily dabbled in too much of their earlier stuff after listening to this, but with ID.Entity I did go back and listen to some of the oldest albums, and this definitely holds up with them in my opinion. The lyrics do feel a little too convoluted for their own taste. That songs like Post Truth just have some sort of cryptic songwriting, and that's fine because the way it's trying to build up the story and tell you it definitely shows. But there's just some points I just feel like lyrically it could just be altered. It just doesn't necessarily make sense, and it's a little bit too hard to follow. But that's just kind of a minor thing. I personally think it's not too bad. And also I just need to say Landmine Blast is just an absolute masterpiece. This album is really good. 3.5 out of 5. The legendary British band Uriah Heep are living in the shadows of famous rock bands from the late 60s, early 70s like Rolling Stones and the Beatles. This band has been non-stop releasing music, with one original member left, Mick Box. They have released their 23rd album, Chaos in Color, and it's pretty good in my opinion. It's not mind-bogglingly great, but I'm not expecting their 23rd album to be relatively their best one, especially since it's gonna reuse some ideas from their earlier stuff as well as some of the newer albums as well from the band. It's relatively good though nonetheless. The songs are pretty enjoyable. There's a lot of the riffs are just definitely give you that Uriah Heep sound, but not in the terms of I've heard it so many times. It has a sort of fresh sound to it, in my opinion. It's not something that needed to be made, considering, like I said, they have done an album relatively like this before. But I mean, it sounds good, then why not? I don't think they can necessarily release their best album. I'm not saying it isn't possible, but I'm doubting it. But Uriah Heep definitely, I think they're going to go on for a little bit longer and release some pretty good albums. I personally think the first 3 songs on this, though, are definitely some of the strongest this album has to offer. Overall, I'll give this album a 3 out of 5. I don't really know what else to say for Uriah Heep, but this album's definitely worth it if you're interested in finding some classic legendary bands from the early 70s. we have a new one by the death metal legends Obituary with Dying of Everything. And the fact that this band has been going for almost 40 years and pretty much releasing bangers still is incredible. This record is honestly really good. It's got pretty good, clean production. It's got a great balance of the old school sound while keeping it fresh with some new ideas, especially within songs like War, which I honestly quite enjoyed. I even thought Without a Conscience as well was one of the strongest performances. Just has some really good hooks, just has some really honestly some pretty good growls and screams on this one. But the second half, in my opinion, I just felt was a lot stronger. It just had some really good songs, especially Be Warned. Definitely a fun, amazing album closer. I've released a pretty good album this year, I would say. It's definitely one of my favourites from him. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Finally, last album is the new one by Katatonia, a Swedish metal band with the Sky Void Stars, which I have been looking forward to for a little while now, actually. City Burials was the previous album, and I consider it to be one of the weakest points in their career. It just didn't really have a strong sound, and a lot of the songs just honestly felt just dry in terms of the direction it wanted to go for. So at least with this, it was experimenting with a whole new flavour, and I actually think this was honestly for the best. This is definitely a much stronger album than before. I honestly consider every track on this album just have a unique sound to play with a lot of elements, which one of the main examples is Opalin, which is completely different from anything that we've had from Katatonia. This was influenced by the Swedish pop rock band Kent with that little electronic intro, I believe, and I definitely enjoy it. It gives the song a more upbeat sound while maintaining the dark lyricism. I can't even pronounce it, but it manages to have a sound that a lot of people would like, a more arena rock sort of direction that I guess maybe not everyone likes it, but something that's more upbeat that people might like, because not everyone likes the darkness of Katatonia, but it still managed to keep the haunting lyrics that this one provides. Honestly, Jonas's voice just gets better with each album, I'd probably say, because as much as I did like The Great Cold Distance vocally, it's beautiful. They have been one-upping themselves quite a bit, but this definitely is one of my favourites of Jonas's for sure vocals throughout. You just have some very haunting moments like Shalera or Impermanence, which just have a beautiful melodic direction to his voice. I mean, we don't really have many uncleans on this, or actually we don't have any uncleans at all, unlike some of the earlier albums, but I think I can live with that considering how beautiful his voice sounds. There's so many great melodies, and just the choruses on all of these tracks just pop out beautifully. Atrium is probably my least favourite song, but the fact that it was the lead single and it's still strong definitely hyped up the rest of the album, in my opinion. Production and mixing, instrumentals, it's all pretty good. It's honestly, the vocals are flawless. I would consider a lot of it just fantastic, and I barely see any problems with it. It just flows so well. And also, I find it interesting that Absconder is a Muse tribute, and it's a bonus track. I think it should have been on the album in general, but hey ho. Yeah, I honestly really enjoyed this album. Katsunia is my favourite band that released an album this month, so I'm a little biased there, obviously. I just know more about Sky Void Stars, but I did listen to everything here twice, and Katatonia probably more than that. I really enjoyed this record. I would say it gets a 4.5 out of 5 in my opinion. It's so close to being a perfect album. I just feel they could have added a little bit more to some of the tracks, like Atrium. It could have had a little bit more going for it, and I guess Drab Moon as well. I personally don't really find much about that iconic other than its chorus, but it's still a really good album in my opinion. I think no matter how many times I'll listen to Dying of Everything, ID.Entity, Chaos in Color, Beyond the Black, I still think Sky Void is Stars, even if I wasn't big on Katatonia, would have probably been the strongest in my opinion. Just, I personally think if I wasn't a fan of the band then, I would be a fan now. And that is my opinion on all the albums I listened to this month. I have missed out a few, but that's because I haven't necessarily heard of them until after recording, which is even though this is in April now, because it's definitely recorded late, or I just didn't get time to checking it out. But if there were some albums I did miss out, I might go back and review it. I'm not too sure, but yeah, this is my first like review, especially reviewing a bunch of albums back to back. It's not necessarily the easiest thing because I'm trying to think of one thing to the next, and I have written a script to help me, but yeah, some of the albums necessarily didn't stand out too much to me, so if I didn't have much to say, that's probably why. Uriah Heep is a big example, but that's mainly because they've got so many albums, and I'm gonna just tell you this: I have not listened to every album from Uriah Heep. It's it would be a huge track just to get this review done to listen to the other 22. But yeah, I honestly did quite enjoy a lot of these albums. MANESKIN was definitely the lowest. Honestly, the weakest point of the month for me. But Katatonia was definitely the strongest. I would consider Katatonia Sky Void Stars the best album of the month. I would then consider Riverside to be the second best album, followed by Obituary, which would be third. I did quite enjoy these albums. They were definitely pretty good albums. Katatonia especially was a fantastic album. And for the worst, the bottom three, I would probably say Måneskin Rush was the worst. I just disliked so many of this album. I thought it was a very bland, flavorless album, and definitely probably the worst thing I've heard. Some of the worst songs from Måneskin I've ever heard. I couldn't care less for this album. And then second worst, I say, was Suasion. I did like We Are Scientists a bit, so I'd say it third, but Suasion I thought was just a big letdown. Whereas We Are Scientists, I'm not a huge fan of anyway, but as much as I did like some of the earlier stuff, like some of the first album especially, I thought it had some good stuff on it. I personally just felt this wasn't necessarily strong direction, or at least it had good ideas, but it wasn't utilised enough to hold up the whole album. I did like some of the songs, and I consider Operator Era a good track. For sure, definitely one of my favourites from We Are Scientists as a whole. But yeah, I just didn't necessarily think it was too strong. But there was a lot. There was more better albums than there were worse albums, and some of the weaker albums weren't too bad, but they just weren't strong enough. But yeah, that's my opinion. Pretty much my review. I might give a separate review for some of these albums. I'm thinking about writing one for Katatonia, like a full in-depth review, but I'm not sure how I'll go around doing that because I personally found it a little bit easier to review it by the month because you had a bunch of stuff, but there's some albums I do want to talk about more in discussion. Maybe I'll just go through track by track and review it. Maybe that might be a bit easier, but that's my review. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I think the next video will be the February review, but I'll also try and work on the Katatonia one, or any other album on here. Maybe I'll review Måneskin. Maybe I'll review Suasion or Riverside. We'll see. But yeah, thank you, and see you.